Madam Deputy Speaker, I move that this House condemns the Leader of the Opposition for deliberately misleading the Australian public on power prices. Mr. Deputy Speaker, let's start with the claim. On Tuesday, the Leader of the Opposition stated, and I quote, "The research shows that the average power bills for a Sydney household have gone up by nearly $1,000, Mr. Speaker." On the same day in Parliament, he said to the Prime Minister, "What about the $1,000 extra that Sydney householders are paying on his watch, Mr. Speaker?" A claim he repeated again in the House yesterday. Yesterday, his shadow spokesman on energy, the member for Port Adelaide, said in the House, and I quote, "Since this government came into office, power bills have gone up by $1,000 for the average Sydney household." Mr. Speaker, that figure is based on data from the government's own Australian energy regulator and the Australian Energy Market Commission, reported in the Australian newspaper, Mr. Speaker. But the Australian newspaper never reported such a figure, Mr. Speaker. He never reported such a figure. It was concocted by the Labor Party and the Leader of the Opposition and was designed to mislead the Australian people, Mr. Speaker. And again, Labor members followed their Leader of the Opposition, repeating this $1,000 false claim. The member for Parramatta, the member for Shortland, the member for Kingsford Smith, the member for Lindsay, the member for Werriwa, the member for Wheels, the member for Cunningham, the member for Hunter and the member for Blaxland all repeated this false claim, Mr. Speaker.
Repetitious deception.
And then Labor's false claim was repeated and used in the media, Mr. Speaker. Last night, in Andrew Probyn's package on the ABC News, it was repeated, this $1,000 false claim, to hundreds of thousands of Australians, Mr. Speaker. But let me tell the House that the Leader of the Opposition's $1,000 claim for an electricity price increase for the average Sydney household is false. It's dishonest, and it's designed to deliberately mislead the Australian people. And it has wrongly asserted data from Australia's independent Australian energy regulator, which was designed to deceive the Australian people. Now, Mr. Speaker, this is what the independent Australian energy regulator has said in response to the claims from those opposite. This is a quote. "The Australian energy regulator has not published any data outlining the price increases claimed in the article, Mr. Speaker. The price increases in the article are inconsistent with the data published by the Australian Energy Regulator. This data suggests that prices have gone down in Sydney by 2.3% from the end of 2013 to July 2017. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I table the advice from the Australian Energy Regulator, Mr. Speaker. Similarly, the independent Australian Energy Market Commission has also stated in response to these claims, and I quote, "The Australian Energy Market Commission's figures cannot be the basis of the estimates of price increases published in the Australian article on July the 10th, 2017, Mr Speaker. And again, I table the advice from the Australian Energy Market Commission, which conflicts with the claims made by those opposite, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, there we have it in black and white. There we have it in black and white. The Leader of the Opposition, his energy spokesman, a host of front bench and back bench colleagues have used the good name of the Australian Energy Regulator and the Australian Energy Market Commission, attributing to them data that never existed, Mr Speaker. Data that never existed. While cooking up on that side of the House a fake figure of $1,000 increase in Sydney households designed to mislead the Australian people. Now, Mr Speaker, I call on the Leader of the Opposition to come clean, to apologise to the Australian people and to come into this House and correct the record, Mr Speaker. Now, Mr Speaker, we have seen this all before. We have seen this all before. Because the Leader of the Opposition, has a pathological pattern of behaviour to deceive, to falsify and to mislead the Australian people, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition has a pathological pattern of behaviour to deceive, to falsify and to mislead the Australian people. It goes to the question of integrity, Mr Speaker, because the Leader of the Opposition is not fit to be Prime Minister of this country, Mr Speaker. He's not fit to be Prime Minister of the country. We all know about Mediscare, Mr Speaker. Mediscare, where those opposite were prepared to deceive millions of Australian pensioners and the most vulnerable in our society with a lie, Mr Speaker, with a mistruth, with a false claim, Mr Speaker. And if we hadn't exposed this $1,000 false claim from the Leader of the Opposition,
you're not in your seat.
Then who would know
the member for Lyons or the member for
that
Cowan?
millions of Australians may have got a text message attributed from the Australian Energy Regulator, Mr Speaker, just like you did with the Mediscare campaign, Mr Speaker. And the Leader of the Opposition, his bad behaviour is not confined to Mediscare. What about his bad behaviour with the workers at Clean Event, Mr Speaker? As a union boss, he sold out the workers to line the pockets of the unions, Mr Speaker. And what about his efforts? What about his efforts getting $100,000 from the good workers in the unions and giving it to Get Up, Mr Speaker? Money that came from the coal workers, Mr Speaker, that was given to Get Up to
the Minister will
close
resume his
coal-fired
seat.
power stations.
The Minister will resume his seat. I call the Leader of Opposition business.
Thanks. I just make a point of order briefly, if I may. This particular resolution, a resolution on notice condemning a Member of Parliament by direct resolution and claiming deliberately misleading, is a resolution rarely moved. When it's moved, the relevance rules are relatively strict, and the Minister has now strayed a long way from the subject of the motion.
I thank the Member for Opposition. I call the Minister.
The members opposite, that the Leader of the Opposition has a pathological pattern of behaviour, Mr Speaker. The pathological pattern of behaviour
Is there a point of order?
Is to deceive, is to falsify and is to mislead the Australian people, Mr Speaker. We know that he has concocted this $1,000 figure. He has taken the good name of the Australian Energy Regulator and the Australian Energy Market Commission, and he has got the Labor members opposite to repeat this false claim and to mislead the Australian people. Now, Mr Speaker, on the issue of rising energy prices, the public's concern is genuine. The public's concern is genuine on the issue of rising power prices. But the Leader of the Opposition's concern is not genuine, Mr Speaker, because when we came to government, At the end of 2013, we inherited a mess. We inherited electricity prices that had increased by more than 100%, and it actually increased by more than that in Sydney, Mr Speaker. We immediately took action to abolish the carbon tax, and you opposite tried 3 times to stop us, Mr Speaker. But when the carbon tax was abolished, we saw the biggest single drop ever recorded, Mr Speaker. And we have the ACCC saying that Australian households were overall $550 better off, Mr Speaker. And when we came to government, as I said to the House yesterday, the Australian Energy Regulator, in their State of the Energy Market report, has shown that electricity bills for an average household in Sydney has varied from increasing by about $1, Mr Speaker, to falling by $473 in accordance with their most latest data in May. Now, Mr Speaker, you take, for example, Ausgrid. In 2013, those customers saw a 3.9% increase. In 2014, they saw a 5.5% decrease. In 2015, they saw a 6.6% decrease. And in 2016, they saw a 9.1% increase. Now, Mr Speaker, we know that Australian households are doing it tough, and on the 1st of July of this year, AGL increased the average Sydney household bills by $296. Origin increased the bills by $310, Mr Speaker. Energy Australia increased the bills by $320. The combined effect of these changes on the average Sydney householder bill since we came to office means that the prices for an average Sydney household family vary from increasing by $321 to decreasing by $177, Mr Speaker. This is nowhere even close to the Labor Party's claim, a fabrication of $1,000. Now, Mr Speaker, I table the AER's documentation indicating those numbers. Now, Mr Speaker, we have taken action on a number of fronts to relieve the pressure on household power bills. The Prime Minister's taken action to provide more gas into the domestic market. The action to rein in the power of the networks. The action to get better deals for the retailers. And the action to keep existing coal-fired power stations going, Mr Speaker. These are all actions of a responsible government focused on affordable, reliable power, Mr Speaker. Now, this contrasts with those opposite. A leader of the opposition who's not fit for government, Mr Speaker. A leader of the opposition who has misappropriated the good name of the Australian Energy Regulator and the Australian Energy Market Commission, Mr Speaker. A leader of the opposition who has come into this place and made up a figure, a false figure of $1,000 increase for average household increase of power prices. The member for Port Adelaide should be ashamed of himself, Mr Speaker. Ashamed of himself, because he has made up a number and misled the House, Mr Speaker. The Labor Party has misled the House. The Labor Party has not produced one valid document, to assert that the correction of their statement, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker,
Member for Hunter.
Mr Speaker,
Member for Hunter.
On this side of the House.
The member for Hunter is defying the chair. Order.
Mr Speaker, I end where I finish, where I started, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition has concocted a number of $1,000 increase, Mr Speaker. He has used the good name of the Australian Energy Regulator and the Australian Energy Market Commission. There is now documentation on the record contradicting and conflicting the claims made by the Labor Party. Only this side of the House is focused on a more affordable, reliable system, and only the Leader of the Opposition does not have the courage or the conviction to come into this House, to be honest with the Australian people, to correct the record and explain why he made up this false figure to mislead and deceive the Australian people.